The Cortex microcontroller is a fully programmable device and is what enables you to incorporate motors, sensors, an LCD screen, and remote control signals all in one robot. Inside of the Cortex microcontroller, there are two separate processors. A user processor that handles all of the Robot C programming instructions, and a master processor to handle lower-level operations, like motor control and VexNet communication. Each processor has its own firmware. Firmware is a special piece of software that acts as the processor's operating system, allowing it to perform its tasks. In this lesson, we will update your Cortex with the latest versions of the Master CPU and Robot C user firmware. Your Cortex may already have older versions of the firmware loaded, but by downloading the latest, we will ensure that it is compatible with Robot C and the latest VEX hardware. Before we begin, make sure that you have a USB A to A cable, a charged robot battery is connected to the Cortex is powered off, you have administrative privileges on your computer, and the latest version of Robot C for Cortex and PIC is installed on your computer. If any of these conditions are not met, pause this video now and complete them before moving on. Now begin by connecting the Cortex to your computer using the USB A to A cable. Wait a few seconds to allow your computer to recognize the Cortex and establish a connection. If your Cortex is part of a moving robot like ours, you should prop it up, as the motors may periodically turn on during the update process. Switch the Cortex to the on position. Now open Robot C and make sure that it is configured to work with the Cortex. Go to Robot, Platform Type, Innovation First IFI, and select either VEX 2.0 Cortex or Natural Language VEX Cortex. Now go to View, select Communication Port. Under the Communications Port drop-down list, you should see Automatic Selection and one of two additional options. If your Cortex is loaded with an older version of the Master CPU firmware, or in a special bootload mode, it will appear as a USB wired cable option. If it is loaded with a newer version of the Master CPU firmware, it will appear as a VEX Robotics COM port. If, however, you don't see either of these options, this indicates that your Cortex has not been properly recognized by Windows. If you've been able to communicate with the Cortex on this computer in the past, you may need to just try disconnecting and reconnecting your robot. If this is your first time using the Cortex, stop this video and make sure you have administrative rights on your computer, and that the driver for the Cortex has been successfully installed. If, however, either the USB wired cable or VEX Robotics COM port is available, you can select it or keep Automatic Selection as your communication port. Now go to the Robot menu, choose Download Firmware, and select Automatically Update VEX Cortex. A message will appear informing you that Robot C will update your Cortex to the latest Master CPU and Robot C firmware files. Press OK to begin the process. A download progress window will appear and begin the Master CPU firmware download. When the Master CPU firmware download is complete, another message will appear and inform you that it will now update the Robot C firmware. Note that if this is the first time a Cortex running a new version of the Master firmware has been connected to your computer, Windows will recognize it as a new device and may prompt you to verify the new hardware installation. Press Continue or Continue anyway to complete the installation. Once the hardware installation completes, press OK on the Robot C message to continue the firmware update process. When the download completes, another Robot C message will appear. Press OK to complete the process. Your Cortex is now fully up to date and ready to be programmed in Robot C. In this lesson, you learned how to update your VEX Cortex with the latest versions of the Master CPU and Robot C firmware. Note that downloading firmware is only necessary once, when you start working with the VEX Cortex or when you update to a newer version of Robot C. You do not need to re-download the firmware each time you program the robot or when you swap out the battery.